Welcome. Hopefully you've all managed to get on the link without difficulty, and hopefully you can hear what I'm saying. The chat's going to be active today, so if you are struggling to hear, you need us to up the volume of what I'm talking about, then do let us know. The chat's also going to be live for any questions that we'll try and answer at the end. So what we're going to try and do today is we're talking about rehabilitation of wrist and forearm stability and proprioceptive control following injury. So big topic, but a shortish presentation, giving you some ideas around how you might attack some of these rehab problems. So the session will be recorded, so you won't be visible on that recording. It's just what we're visually seeing today and my initial talk. And you'll be emailed a copy of that, and that's also going to be available on the Performance Health website. So just moving on to what the plan is for today, we are going to do 10 minutes of a little bit of theory, a little bit of background to set the scene, and then we are going to go into some of the exercise products that we've got here, and then look at how we might use those with Nicola, who's our patient model for today. So just moving into me, don't really want to talk about me very much, but I'm a qualified physiotherapist. I've worked for 20 plus years in specialist field of hand therapy, working mostly in an NHS organisation, so National Health Organisation, but some private work outside. I've got a special interest in these kind of undiagnosed wrist pains, wrist rehab, complex trauma, and some CRPS management. So that's my kind of background. What are we aiming for today? So we want to explore the use of various exercise products to enhance rehabilitation of patients preventing poor muscle stability and control following musculoskeletal injury to the forearm and wrist. It's a nice good phrase, but these are your classic patients that come through with self-referred wrist pain or undiagnosed wrist pain that come through to maybe your sports injury clinic, your first contact practitioner clinic, or maybe into a more specialist secondary centre for hand therapy. We're going to demonstrate some practical applications of the kit that we've got, and we're going to explore progression of the exercise through that. So how do you mould a program for your patient? How do you build that to support your patient from initial acute stages of limited function to full functional sports, practical employment type level of function? So we're using some of the performance health kit, so looking at some of the things that they've got available. There are other things available from other suppliers, that's there, we all know that, but today we're just going to focus on what's available from performance health and how you might utilise some of those. So just to add some context, as clinicians, we all have to think of that practical application of this. So I've just put two example patients that I've seen recently that come through the clinic. We've got a 22-year-old male with a 6-month history of insidious onset vague wrist pain. So not a great historian, just comes in and says, I've got this wrist pain. Works in a sedentary-based desk job. He's not specifically active in any old sports, but occasionally goes to the gym for general fitness. All of investigations have been negative, and his clinical examination reveals no specific localization of pain, just a general feeling of achiness across the wrist and a lack of endurance. So that patient that's not your great historian doesn't really necessarily able to localize his symptoms. And then we've got another patient. So patient B is a 46-year-old female who fell over playing netball. Her MRI revealed bony bruising to a distal radius with associated mild dorsal radiocarpal synovitis. So an irritable wrist. The capsule, the supporting structures are irritable. We haven't got any specific ligament damage. Symptoms are now settling. Patients started to return to netball, but they remain weak and limited with wrist strength and control on upper limb weight bearing. So she reports the wrist gets tired after about half an hour of playing. So these are our two thought patients to provoke thinking about how you might utilise these exercises within your clinic. So some of the theory, what do we know? So there's lots of work going on. There's lots of stuff we don't know yet, but some of the stuff that has been published that's quite well written about. The idea that functional movement happens in certain planes of movement So some of the studies have looked at how that's monitored, how that works. And essentially what we're looking at is 40 degrees of wrist extension to 20 degrees of radial deviation, across to 0 degrees flexion and 20 degrees ulnar deviation. So this is this plane of movement. If you think about it, all the things we're doing, where everything happens are in this similar plane of movement. There's lots of things that go outside that movement, and you have to be aware of that. But that's where we're most active. This term dart throw motion is bandied around, and that's where we're thinking about throwing a dart in that similar plane that's researched. We've also found out that a significant proportion of this movement happens within the carpus, the mid-carpal joint. So we all think of our wrist down here, all patients think of their wrist as down here, but actually it extends quite a long way up. And there's all interactions of multiple movements within that. We know that wrist ligaments have a significant sensory function in dynamic function. So these mechanoreceptors, particularly around the dorsal aspect of the scapholunate ligaments, dorsally across the wrist, they have a huge function in giving information back to our body to allow muscles to fire in different ways. And research suggests concentration on FCR, so flexor carpi radialis, extensor carpi radialis longus, and abductor pollicis longus for carpal stability are really important. There's other muscles that are involved in different ranges, but these have been suggested to be primarily important for wrist stability. What else do we know? Well, there was this concept of ring stability, so this concept that the triangular fibrocartilage at the wrist, the distal radial ulnar joint, the radius and ulna, and the proximal radial ulnar joint alongside the interosseous membrane form this ring, a bit like the pelvic ring, where you've got this stable construct. That was a concept that was much more surgically based. What we know is patients don't stay still. They move, they mold that position, but essentially as a basis, that's quite a good concept to think about. We know that medial elbow muscles are stable in supination. So wrist flexion, forearm supination is a much more stable position. And then our lateral elbow muscles produce stability in pronation. So this is things to think about based on where the patient wants to function and where their symptoms might be. But don't forget, proximal stability is required for distal mobility. We can't do anything here without stability in the trunk, in the shoulder girdle, in the elbow. So all those patients that come into you saying, I've got a painful wrist, I've been doing exercises with a stress ball. That might not necessarily be wrong, but actually it not necessarily addresses the cause of the problem. The stability might be way more proximally than distally. So we're going to try and cover some of that with some of the exercises we're using. So we're going to look at gross motor development from terms of upper trunk. So we're thinking core control of spinal posture. We're thinking shoulder girdle positioning with shoulder and elbow stability, as we've just talked about. We've got ulnar stability complementing radial mobility. That radius moves around your stable ulnar. Static and dynamic wrist extension through range, loading, controlling those positions. Release of the palmar arch so we can grasp and release objects in whatever position and range. And thumb and finger contraction with wide and narrow span. Wide and narrow span, if you think of narrow span as a grip, as a fist, we're close packing all those structures, all those jigsaw of bones to provide a stable construct. And then when we're opening that, we're taking that away or reducing that. So again, it has a different impact on things. So exercise principles here, I'm not really going to go through huge amounts of that, but these are some of the things we're going to look at: isometric loading, eccentric activity, concentric activity, and as we know, functionally combinations of these movements. So what equipment are we going to look at? So a lot of based around TheraBand. So TheraBand is a fantastic material. All of you probably have had experience in using some form of resistant, stretchy, elastic bands. TheraBand was the original product from that, and it's gone through huge amounts of testing, repeat loading, tear resistance, dermal testing to see if it reacts with patient's skin. So it's very well researched, and the research is out there if you want to look at that. Something that's quite new to me, I haven't really experienced a huge amount of this up until recently, is the consecutive loops, which is called CLX TheraBand. Essentially, it gets rid of the need to tie knots and things. So we've got lots of loops right the way along the length of the band, and you can then utilize them for hooking into, holding on to, providing different things. So again, we're going to show some of the uses of that, and that's quite interesting to think about based on what we would normally purchase in a therapy clinic. TheraBand loop, so this is available, and I think probably for me, the CLX trumps the TheraBand loop. So it was the idea of getting rid of knots, but it is a latex containing product. So a lot of national health organisations in the UK won't purchase this because they're latex free. So just be aware if you are using this that it does contain latex. Soft weights, so these are fantastic. We use loads of these. So different weighted balls. So this is a lightweight at 1 kilogram. The green weight comes in at, I think, 2 kilograms, and there's different weights between that. So nice, relatively graspable. So we use these for a lot of different functional tasks and functional rehab later on. Flex bar. So the flex bars, again, very good product, but they're latex containing. So again, it might stop you from using these. So these are flexible with a different grasp diameter and different resistance to bending, twisting, and they have a flexible use to them for some of the rehab. So we're going to have a look at some of these, but actually you may find that that's not something you can use because of the latex. And then some of the putties, again, you'll be very familiar with some of these, provide a really nice resistance to function and activity. One of the nice things about the Ronian therapy putty is it doesn't leak colour. There's lots of them. We've tried different ones here, and some of them leak colour, and that can be a bit annoying for patients. Patients don't really like that. So these don't leak colour, and I feel they provide quite a nice resistance to movement and a consistent resistance to movement. Gym balls, again, most people are going to wear these multiple sizes, again, produced on the TheraBand branding. Again, lots of gym balls out there, but that is, again, produced by Performance Health if you want to go down that route. And something else, the power ball, really useful, and we'll utilise this later on. So this is a ball, in case you haven't been aware of it, with a gyroscope in the middle, and we're going to use the spinning of that gyroscope and movements of our hand to create challenges for wrist stability later on. Just a little bit about the progression of loading before we go into the practice. One of the things that we always look at is, how far we stretch the band, what does it do? So each of these bands have a different resistance level, and they're graded on the colours, and you can see them on the screen, starting with yellow, ending up in the really quite challenging, more your elite sports people, your really active sports people, the silver and gold levels. But what I hadn't probably fully appreciated until recently is that depending on how much you stretch the band, it will increase the weighting of that band. So it's really nice little graph there to show you that, say at 50%, so we're talking about, if I get my red band, so this is the percentage of total elongation. So say we're going this length, if I'm going 100%, I'm out at this length. So 100% of the red TheraBand would be a 2 kilogram load. Whereas if I'm going to 50% elongation, I'm only creating a 1.5 kilogram load. So that's something to think about, how when you progress your patients through the exercises, and maybe they're finding it a bit challenging, are they stretching it too far? Can you reduce that without having to think, actually, I need a yellow band rather than a red band? Can I just reduce the tension on that band to reduce the load? So each colour band generally takes up 25% increase in load. For the later ones, the silver and gold is a 40%. So it's that extreme jump for those patients that need it. And having included the flex bar one, just for your information, just gives you a little bit of an idea of how the diameters change and how the loading changes. So useful information to have a look at in your clinics. And now we're going to go on to this practical application of this. So we're just going to move the room a little bit. So we're thinking about our patients. If you'd like to come forward, Nick, I'll bring the tape light to you. So what we're going to think about, we're going to use the CLX band to start with. But what we've got to do is think about our patient. Our patients come in from a maybe cold car park. They've come in after work and they've been busy, or they're squeezing it in their day. So we've got to wake these muscles up. Around lunate injuries, try and get fibrocartilage injuries, which I'll expand into a little bit. There's not really enough in this session to go into that in lots of detail. But we've got to wake these hands up. So they might be cold. We want good blood flow in there. We want all of those tissues woken up. And how do we do that? So very simple. We might ask the patient to place their hand in a warm water bath. We might use a hot pack initially if they're particularly cold. We really want to loosen things up. But in a clinic session, there's not always time for that. So one of the things I use quite a lot is the massage ball. Really useful. And all we're doing with your patient, be very careful if you've got patients with hypersensitivity. I probably wouldn't use this. I'd use more tactile touch or use the patient themselves touching. So be very careful if you've got patients that are hypersensitive or have CRPS type symptoms. So with CRPS, we mean complex regional pain syndrome, so that really hypersensitive patient. But this is quite nice to just literally be able to roll up the musculature of the arm, and you're gently moving the patient about, not really pressing, just providing these little bobbles, giving stimulus to those sensory nerve endings, waking them up. We want them thinking, we want them listening. In the hand, I would probably get the patients just rolling that hand round, cupping around the board, feeling the board, squeezing the board, just starting to get everything woken up. That's really useful, pretty simple. You could do it with other balls, you could do it with different bits of material. So, but they're quite useful for that. So how are we going to start? So we're going to start with static position. So we've said we need proximal stability. So proximal stability is really important. I think if you start going too early into proximal stability, so core stability, shoulder control, which we're going to talk about later, the patient thinks, what are you doing? I've got a wrist problem. Why are you sitting me on a gym ball or something? So I always start by taking out some of that influence of shoulder instability. So I get my patient resting with their elbow on the table, trying to get them in a good posture, good position, not too low or too high, and resting on a soft towel or cushion. Then from that position, we want to start activating these muscles. So we've talked about this 40-degree extension. We've talked about 20 degrees radial deviated across to our dart throw motion type position. So we're going to start waking up those muscles in that position, turning them on, getting the patient used to what we're talking about. So you can use your flat band or you can use your consecutive loop. Consecutive loop comes in a length, or you can have trimmable lengths. This is just a single length. So we'll use this because we use it for other things. Quite nice because you can then just loop it around your patient. So initially, all I'm going to start with is looping it through my patient's fingers. We don't want them to really grip hard, because if we've got ligament struggles, then we don't want to close pack those ligaments and really stress them. So we ask the patient to just loosely grip. And that's a big advantage of the loop over a straight band, because the patient's really got to grip onto that, which might not be as useful. So all we're going to do, I'm going to say to my patient, right, I want you to come into this start position. So we're slightly extended, slightly radially deviated. I'm just going to position that position, okay? And all I'm then going to do is apply a light load on that position. And I'm going to say to my patient, I'd like you to keep your hands still. I don't want you to let your wrist or your forearm move. I'm going to apply that force. So an isometric load, initially with a really low stretch to take the load off. And I'm then going to look at my patient's symptoms. Does it aggravate their pain? Do you find they're starting to collapse? How acute are they? If that doesn't work, I might reduce my load. If I'm right up with making it slack, then I'm going to start to think about lowering my resistance down to yellow. If the patient's tolerating that, I can start to say, okay, I'm going to put the stretch on. What I tend not to do is pull it with the patient resisting. I tend to put the load on and then say, right, now I want you to hold it still, and I'm going to let go of your hand. And ask them just to hold and control. And you're looking for control. So you're not looking for shaky muscles. You're not looking for increased flexion or extension. You're looking for this nice hold position. 10 or 15 seconds to start with. See how your patient reacts. Are they sore? Does it aggravate pain? If it does, try tweaking the start position. Sometimes there's a little bit too much radial deviation. If you bring them back towards neutral a bit more, they're a bit more comfortable. Again, get a feel for your patient. Can they tolerate that endurance-wise, or do they really start to struggle? How many repetitions do they start to struggle with? So we've said we're working on our ECRL. So we're controlling that position. We know as well, APL also provides some stability. So I'll then bring my patient into that position, okay, with their thumb abducted. And then I'll put a similar force load. So I want you just to relax your fingers a little more and stabilize and hold that position. Don't let it move. So this again is starting to activate and control, which is shown to help stabilize your scapholunate structures and the sort of central stabilizing portion of your wrist. Now be very careful if you've got a patient with OA thumb, or you've got a patient that's very hypermobile, that's got quite hypermobile carpal metacarpal joint. It would be very easy to overload that and potentially sublux it or flare up an OA in the hand. So just be a bit careful with that, and be careful when you're loading the resistance on. Now, we want rounded rehab, so we don't want to just load one side. So we're going to come onto the other side. So we're going to spin that around our patient, we're going to lump it through the thumb, and we're going to do the same thing isometrically in that position. So Nicola will isolate and hold the band up at her shoulder, away from her face. Nicola wears glasses, so it's not such an issue, but you might want to use, and we'd recommend that you use safety goggles for your patient in case it pings into their face. So always warn your patient about that. And you're wrapping the band around the wrist, not the fingers. And again, what we're applying here is we're applying, I would take the hand away and ask Nicola to hold the ulnar deviated position and neutral wrist extension. Don't let your hand move. Again, we hold it for a short amount of time and then come back up. Okay, so that's our isometric exercises in our movement positions. The other positions we want to do, I'll just come out here and I'll just demonstrate these before we move on to some of the dynamic ones, is an eccentric wrist loading with our arm supported. So again, we're taking out the shoulder stability and elbow stability, we're using the forearm. So what we're wanting to do is position the hand in our extended position, slightly radially deviated. So ECRL we're looking at working here, and then we're applying a light force isometrically, patient holds. And again, you can either have a tight grip or an open hand, which might change the difficulty for the patient, and then release that band. Now, if your patient can't get to pronation, you might do it in a different position. But remember, when you're doing it in a different position, you can't just pull straight down. You've got to change your arc of pull so that you're specifically targeting that position. The other position that we know is quite important is FCR, so flexor carpi radialis in supination, so stabilizing and protecting the dorsal part of that stable scapholunate construct. So again, the same thing, we're putting the load on, holding the position. Now, it's very easy for patients to do that in this position. So if I demonstrate, they tend to do that and overwork flexor carpi ulnaris and extensor carpi ulnaris, which has been shown to be detrimental and loading of the scaphoid side of the wrist. So if you can't get into this position, make sure that you can take your patient slightly extended and radially deviated and then apply your load. Okay, so we've done that static, we've done that isometric exercise. Now we want to say to the patient, right, okay, we switched on those muscles. Can we do this dynamically? Can we start to build in movement? And the way we do that is using what I term a resisted dart throw motion and reverse dart throw motion. So exactly the same as our static positions. So the patient's already aware of what we're going to do. So we would start again, the elbow resting on a towel, looping our band through, making sure it's comfortable for our patient. Our patient starts anchoring up at the shoulder. Okay, and what you're going to ask your patient to do is push away and then tip the wrist away. So they're starting in that extended position. So if I show you this yellow band. So we're starting resting, elbow extended, radially deviated. We're going to anchor the band and they're going to push away. And then they're going to only deviate to that neutral position. And that's the start position for our exercise. And then we're going to eccentrically control, so when the muscle's lengthening, the return to that top start position. So we know there's a greater strength gain with eccentric loading, and functionally, we're not often mobilizing the wrist, we're tending to stabilize a structure whilst we're having a load in the opposite direction. So those muscles are loaded in that eccentric movement. So with our patient's just going to start in our nice dart throw motion, and then they're going to push away with the elbow to start with, and dip the wrist away, and then slowly return and control the position to the top. So your patient might shake a little bit, and that's the sort of cues you're saying to your patient. We don't want you to shake, we want it to be a nice, smooth, controlled movement. And how far do you go out? Well, if your patient gets to here and is really starting to stimulate their symptoms or is really losing the quality of the movement, stop at that point, come back to that point that's the limit, and then work to going out fully. So the reverse dart throw, the same thing, exactly the same as our isometric exercises. We're loading round again. So this time we start the patient out in extension. So Nicola, if you'd like to hold on to the band there, and then you're going to pull that band up towards you and radially deviate. So one of the things patients tend to do in this position is they tend to rotate and flex. Again, we're working the wrong muscles, we're loading the ligaments. We want to come back into our powerful functional position. And literally coming back. That again is our start position. And then we're slowly lowering down. Often patients go, well, this is a bit easy, because this is our powerful lifting position, isn't it? So often patients say that's a bit easy. So again, I would get them quite tight down the bottom to increase the resistance, but also talk to them about this is about endurance. This is about the ability to hold a load, manipulate a load for an extended period. So we're wanting to switch these on. So I work on these two, the dart throw with the resistance band and the reverse dart throw. Okay. We also, in our, we take the band, in our position over the edge of the table, we do eccentric ECRL loading again. So we're coming back up here, starting the position there, applying the band, and then slowly controlling. You can see my fingers and wrist shaking there. So that's that eccentric release of those muscles. So as I get stronger and better endurance with that, it'll be a smoother movement. And likewise for our flexion, remember we're flexing radially slightly, we're not going into ulnar deviation. So we start in that position, apply our load, relaxing our fingers, and then slowly let that come down. So these are nice, easy exercises that you can carry out with the band. Stick it in your handbag, you can stick it in your suitcase, whether you're on holiday, whether you're at work, very easy to reproduce in a working environment. So they're nice ones that the patient can do. Some of these nice little boxes, so again, easy if you are working in private practice, not expensive for your patient to buy, but again, a really nice thing within the clinic to have. So, the other thing that is available, we're not going to spend a huge amount of time on it because it's not so useful for wrist rehab, but the therapy putty. So the therapy putty has resistance to it. So it's got all our resisted loads. So I don't use this huge amounts for our patients, but it may be that you've got a patient that you want to do specific loading for, and we'll just get using a graded tearing, kneading, molding of it. So it is there, but it's not something we use it. I use it so much for. I try to use more the resistance bands, and this is much more useful for dexterity, intrinsic muscle function later on. So more different injuries or more dexterous injuries later on. So just moving on, now we're going to come on to our gross motor development principles. So we're thinking of our proximal stability. Have we got a good core stabilization? Is the patient sitting there trying to do this function slouched at his desk? Our patient A, is he working from home in a really inappropriate position? You know, we've had some staff working that sit on a bar stool at a chest of drawers. So thinking about all of that posture and building that up. Have we got patients that have been previously strong, but because of their injury haven't trained and started to get weak? So really simple way, using our two ball. If I can stand you up, Nick, and I'll just move this chair out of the way. So pretty easy. Gym balls available in most departments, very easy for patients to access online and things. So if you just like to sit on the ball. So with our patient, we literally just start just getting them to balance. So pure balance, stabilizing, thinking about our core control. So activating that core, trying to think about we're not too anteriorly tilted, we're not too posteriorly tilted, we're in that nice little Pilates position, tucking up, pelvic floor muscles, holding into those spinal stabilizers, all the stuff that you know for back pain and such like. So trying to get in that good posture. Then we're thinking of that shoulder position. So sinking shoulders, shoulder blades into a soft V in the back. So we're not retracting, we're sinking down. And getting the patient in that nice position, often just follows all those tips that you would tell your patient for your ergonomic stuff. Then with the ball, beauty of that is you can then start either narrowing the feet position to bring you in to make it a little bit harder to balance, or you can widen the feet position and get your patient to start rocking, rolling. So you're sliding side to side, and you might do circles. So all the stuff that you already know and already do for your back pain patients, but don't neglect it for your wrist patients. These things are really important. It might get your patient mobile, it might give your patient confidence. You can also start to free up the hands. So Nicola's stabilizing on her knees there, but you may bring that up to say, actually, I just want you to release that arm a little bit, make it a little bit more of a challenge. Later on, if you've got athletes and you've got people that are at a high level of this, you can start to put resistance bands either around the torso, onto the arms to start making that more of a challenge appropriate to your patient. So very simple things that we're doing on there. So if you just stand up again for this, we're just going to look at shoulder stability. So a lot of our patients either come in that are quite hypermobile or they're quite poorly conditioned. They're not very active exercise, they might be overweight, as I say, they may be very rounded in their posture. So we want to start switching on all of this shoulder stability to then allow us to do function, to allow us to reach. So our sports lady who's doing her netball, so it may be that actually, because she's deconditioned with her wrist injury, she's fatiguing distally because actually she's got poor proximal control and poor proximal endurance. So again, really simple to use some of the bands. Okay, one of the other things that's very useful, there is a TheraBand door anchor. So again, rather than patients pulling off their door handles, really simple to use. It's just a rubber bung that you sandwich in the door, that you can sandwich at whatever level over the top. So we're just going to place it in the middle, and you essentially just shut that in the door. It doesn't shut very well on this one. But once it's in, soft material so it doesn't cause a lot of damage, and then you can attach different bands to it at whatever height you want to do. So initially, I would generally start thinking of our principles of short levers and long levers, making work harder. So again, the nice thing about the CLX band, we're going to come up onto the arm. And what we're going to ask Nicola to do, just to go into step stance, because it's a little bit more stable. If you just come off the mat, so we haven't got the wobble of the mat. And all we're going to ask Nicola to do is hold elbow at 90 degrees, and we're just going to say, I want to stabilize that position. So set your posture, relax your shoulders into that soft V, and then we're just going to provide a gentle sideways load, stabilizing. Then we can change the position of that load. Be careful with the circle of the CLX. Rotate it round, otherwise you find that you're doing the patient a little bit of a friction load to the skin. And then again, the static loading. And then we can go on to some bilateral loading. So we could bring that in onto the other side. So functional positions where you're providing, I'll put that where, you just turn sideways so you can see. And again, you're statically setting that posture, and then I can provide a load to that. And we're thinking about those scapular stabilizers, those shoulder girdle stabilizers to hold posture. And then you might then ask the patient to just gently bend the elbows while you're maintaining that position and straighten them out. And then you can change the direction of loading. And again, you can put different loads and different bands to start getting your patient dynamically working their core, but also working your shoulder stabilizers. So again, really important to make sure your patient is good and controlled around their hands. Remember, if you've got a patient that's fallen over, our lady who fell over playing netball, all of that force has gone through her wrist, a hand, her elbow, her shoulder, and her spine. So all of those things can be affected. That sort of shunt that you get in the shoulder, there may be a rotator cuff issue that you need to think about with that. So link in, if you don't deal with these sorts of things, linking with your shoulder specialist, your shoulder therapist to work out some specific exercises. That's always very useful. The other thing for rigging up at home, really simple, as I say, the door anchor. So you just turn around, it loops through. And again, your patient can hold on to them as bars. If they find grip difficult, you can loop them around the wrists. And the sorts of things you're doing is you're looking at pulling down and back. So if you just bring your hands slightly further forwards to start with, okay, and then you're pulling down and back. You then might also ask your patient to open out their elbows, so just widen your elbows as you pull forwards and loading back. Again, not particularly complex exercises. This should be nothing new for you guys that are doing all of this rehab, but things that are important to start thinking about with stability. Okay, so lots of that is there. So once we've got some shoulder mobility, we've switched on the core, we want to think about our forearm. So coming back to where we've got our symptoms. So elbow stability, wrist stability. So we've talked about this position of supination flexors, pronation extensors, providing proximal stability here. So we're that patient that's reaching for a load. We've switched on our core, we've got good shoulder stability, but we've still got to have good elbow stability to allow us to functionally grip and release. So there's several things that we can use. The TheraBand again is very useful for this. It's a little bit less controlled and your patient can get in a little bit of a pickle with it. So if we're thinking about supination, and loading. So again, we can just stretch the band. Now, the problem with patients is what they'll do is you teach them in the session, and this is nothing to patients, this is about how we teach it, is that as they come back, they're losing retention. So actually you're just doing a physiological movement rather than a resisted movement. So it is there, and it can be useful if the patient's not at home. And again, bringing some of these movements into rotation here. If you've got the door anchor, you could lower the door anchor. You can slow that down the door now. Again. Lower the door anchor down, and you could do some of that across the body, but then you start to bring in shoulder. So as you start to go higher with your resistance, you start to bring in other things. So you could do that. And again, that would be a really nice exercise for your sports person that's a little bit stronger. Okay, be careful of wrapping the thumb and loading the thumb as well. But one of the things that I quite like for this is the flex bar. Again, as I said, there's a little disadvantage for latex, but this is a really nice position. You can change the position of it and getting this rotation. So you've got a concentric movement and then an eccentric rotation. Bilateral as well, so again, it makes it very functional. Relatively easy to take where you want to go, and again, coming to these positions. And the idea is that full resistance is when you create a U shape with that structure. So it's got better control, it's a bit more functional, and as you start going into it, you can see it starts creating a little bit more load. Another thing you can do with the bar is starting to do rotation, but that's a little bit more advanced for your patient. So what you'd ask your patient to do is hold onto the bar at each end and just see if you can bend it to a U shape. And then you're going to watch your patient. What happens up here? Do they start to use accessory movements? Do they dip their shoulder? Do they start to shrug their shoulder? Is it a controlled movement bilaterally? Actually, have we started to increase pain? Do we have poor control proximally, and that's why we're not getting control distally? And how does the patient work that? Do they start to roll in and use the more powerful muscles, or are they using these pronators and supinators? And that's what we want. We want endurance in this movement so that you can take a load, you can manipulate that load through a range of rotation without losing the quality of the contraction and control in it. Thank you. The other thing I like to go on with some patients to make it a little bit more interesting is these soft weights. So I use these quite a lot for, or not necessarily these, but balls, different things, but certainly these are very good for that. And what we're looking at here is thinking about functional reaching and loading. If you haven't got a wide grip, you can't necessarily hold that. But if your patient's got a wide grip, then that's quite useful. So what I often do with the patient is start on here and just get them to balance that load. And coming round, rotating, taking that load. So what we're saying to the patient is we're balancing the load, so we're switching on all these muscles. Again, if your patient to start with their core, start with their shoulder stability. So start just with the elbow a little bit more flexed. And what I want you to do is rotate the ball round and balance it above your shoulder. So it requires a little bit of control for it not to topple off, but it also is starting to release this chain of movement that your patient might need for reaching, for gripping, for grabbing. Okay, so that's really quite nice. And then what you can say to your patient, a little bit more advanced, take that lever and that weight slightly further away from the proximal load. So again, you can do the same thing. You're going to bend back and come back up, and then you're going to reach out. So that's quite a nice one to do. Patients quite like that one. It's quite repeatable at home. It doesn't need to be a ball. It could be some other weight that they've got. If you've got a patient that can grip it and has got the control, thinking of we're trying to do our ECRL and our abductor policies longer, so gripping the ball is quite good, even if they can just hold it. But again, you can do the same process, pushing out, and then you can start doing thinking PNF patterns coming across your body. Different degrees of rotation that allow much more functional loading. Again, you can up the weights, change the challenge, put the lever further away. So these are really useful, particularly for a clinic. They're nice. The patient may never buy these, but actually for a clinic, they're really useful, the washable, etc. So they're really useful. The other thing I do with these, and sometimes a football, is a give and receive. So we'll do it with the ball. What I want you to do, if you can hold that ball into your stomach, and I want you to put it out to me, and I will take it from you. Okay, so I'm going to take it like this. What I'm then going to say to Nicola is, I want you to then let go of the ball and go back to your start position. I'm going to rotate the ball. Now I want you to take it from the top and bottom. So we're getting the patient to reach out, rotate, and you can change that rotation direction in different directions. You can take them to take it diagonally. and you're starting to think about how they would take a load function. I always start with a ball generally because it's nice and light, but then we do go into some of the balls like this height or some of these slightly larger weighted balls. So you're coming into there, so you're putting in a resistance again. So reach out with your resistance, I'll take it. Come back now, reach out onto the top and rotate that back. And then you'll rotate in both directions. So be careful not to just repeat the same thing. Make sure you go in both directions. So that's quite a nice exercise, really easy to do, gets the patient on their feet, gets their core activated. And you might say for this patient that does all these things at a desk, you sit him at a desk and do some of that, because actually he may be getting a lot of his symptoms at a desk. So how are we going to progress that? So we like to start adding in weight bearing as well. So we've done lots of open chain stuff, but with a weight on the end. But actually, a lot of this is weight bearing. So our patient who's a netball player didn't like weight bearing. So quite often we'll use a ball against the wall initially and just lean onto that. We might go into step stance to improve the stability, but we're just easing some weight. And the nice thing about step stance is you can start with relatively low weight, and then you can build up your weight onto that. So we might start with a ball and build on those. Or you might start with something smaller, like a weighted ball. So we've got the shoulder stability and the weight of the ball, and the sorts of things we're asking patients to do. So this is about our wrist extension through range. So just rolling the ball up and down, side to side. Then you might start doing circles in both directions. You might see if you can get further round if the patient needs to load in flexion. Not so easy on a smaller ball, but on the football it's quite nice and easy to do that. You can get your patient to go right the way over the top almost and control it. Then you can get them loading. You might start with bilateral loading, 2 hands, and moving it about, and then go on to your single limb loading. Always be aware of your patient's symptoms. Be aware they may not have shoulder range of motion. If your patient hasn't got shoulder range of motion, so if you can't see anything, you could then lean onto a board, onto a plinth. So again, go into step stance and holding that position, and you might then roll into that. So again, it's a bit more control for your patient, and you can grade it. We haven't got any today. This is a different company that make these, but Performance Health do provide some wobble cushions. You've probably seen different ones. Again, they've got a really nice set that are sort of oval shaped for both hands. They're currently out of stock, but again, they're quite useful for doing bilateral weight bearing, getting patients to go into different directions, starting dynamic control of these things. Okay. The other thing we want to talk about is the power board. So the power board is a fantastic piece of kit. So essentially it's a gyroscope within a plastic board. And the idea is that you spin the gyroscope and you use your wrist movements to rotate that. And what happens, and I'll just get it going, you spin it to start with, and you use a rotation to provide that. And the idea is that you listen, I'll bring it closer to the microphone. You listen to the sound and it will start to buzz, okay? And you're using a rotation. It doesn't have to be really quick, but what you're doing is you're taking all of your wrist muscles and firing them to get the ball spinning. So you're getting a really good endurance workout for your forearm. And what happens is the ball wants to drift about. It wants to wriggle about in your hand. And it's using all those mechanoreceptors, switching all of those mechanoreceptors on to challenge your wrist. Again, really nice, easy one. Band of CLX, power board, maybe a massage board. Very simple for patients to set up at home and affordable for patients that maybe can't afford lots of input. Cheap for clinics to buy, not huge amounts of kit. The other thing we're looking at lastly, just the final thing, again, we're running out of time. So I think it's more about functional loading. So if we think about our patients, you come back to the middle. So if we've got our patient that's sedentary, that sits at a desk all day on a chair, think of your ergonomics, think of your position, okay? So we might say this man has trouble when he's using his computer mouse, he starts to get wrist pain. So we might say, let's pop some banding on and start loading his wrist in that pronated position. So you get him holding his computer mouse, and you might provide some directional loading for that. Loading in different directions, loading in different processes. It might be that some of this we've talked about is the proximal stability. So we might start thinking, actually, this ball's quite nice to hold, similar-ish to a mouse. So you might get them to grip and reach that ball out. So if you just hold onto the ball and you can lift it up, place it out, and then place it back. thinking of your shoulder posture, thinking of your wrist posture. So starting to build into some of these things. And remember, computer work, mouse work, lots of micro movements. So we don't want big, large movements for strength. It may be that you say to your patient, what I want you to do is lift the ball and do a tiny little movement and repeat that movement. So you're functionally making it towards what they're doing. Okay, and just going on finally to our sports person. So later on, we might start adding in even more type, ballistic type exercises. So the really nice thing about your CLX, so say we have Nicola wanting to come back to her netball. So we're going to slide the hand in here. And we're going to slide the hand in here. So they just come into the middle. And then she's going to hold on to her netball. Okay. And then we're going to say, right, okay, what I want you to do, just tuck the elbows into that's lovely. And you're going to push out as if you're going to throw a ball. So you're pushing that ball away. Nice and slowly to start with, and then controlled coming back. So that pushing away is that concentric loading, but also an eccentric control. So that replicates catching the ball. And then you might say, right, okay, later on, it's a high velocity shot. So Nicola's going to push out as hard as she can and really work hard into that. So the band is really good at giving a good consistent load to that. So you can really label that. And then we might say, okay, it's a contact sport. So Nicola's going to do the same push out shot, but we're going to load it in a different direction because there's a force coming from a different direction. And then you can make it much more sport specific. So that's a very quick run through of some of the things you might do to build up resistance and load. So just as a quick summary before we start taking any questions that might be in the chat. So some of the tips that I would go from experience is think about be guided by your symptoms, talk to your patients, really know and understand what your patient's experiencing, where they experience it, what specific positions, think about diaries, patients writing down specifically what they're doing, spend time assessing the patient, think about those aggravating positions. Use your diagnostics if you've got availability to them. So it's really helpful if you've got a patient that's really not progressing, you've got very undiagnosed symptoms, you think there might be some ligament involvement, try and get the diagnostics around MRI scanning with contrast to look at the ligaments, to look at the structures, and then you can really focus your rehab on the specific areas that are causing problems. Remember, endurance before power and strength. You can't, most of our function is not ballistic, it's stabilizing loads. So think about that endurance. Don't neglect building up the endurance before you go on to strength. As I say, most patients come in and go, I've been squeezing a strength ball, I've been squeezing one of the springs. So we want to reduce that down. And repetition. Think about repetition for proprioceptive control, getting good movement patterns, good muscle memory. Okay, so a very quick run through. So there's a lot more to it, and there's a lot more specifics, but a very quick run through of some of the stuff you could do. Patients are under pressure financially. NHS trusts are always under pressure financially. So the products here, the TheraBand is available on the NHS supplies. So is the Therapy. All of the other stuff is available. Performance Health do have a shop through Amazon as well. So again, it's very easily available for patients, and you can know the quality and the reliability of the products. But actually, it's relatively cheap. You know, a Powerball might be £15, and a piece of TheraBand might be, I don't know, £7 or £8. So suddenly you've got enough kit with 3 or 4 bits of kit in a department to do a full rehab of wrist patients. So it doesn't cost very much. So that's really good to go to managers and say, actually, it's not going to cost us very much to go through some of these and rehab our patients with some kit. So thank you for listening. I don't know if we've got anything in the chat. Nicole's going to help us run the chat, so she's just going to move across. But do put things in the chat if there is anything that you do want to know. And if we don't get a chance to do it today, because we are running a bit short on time, then we will try and answer any of the questions in the chat at a later date.
There was one question about the pressure pads. The chair was in the way when you were, so I don't know if you want to.
These ones.
Yes, I don't know if you want to.
So these aren't Performance Health. These are something we have locally. So if you go on the Performance Health website, I can't remember exactly what they're called, but essentially what we're doing is a wobble cushion. So we're looking at soft mobile structure, and in this case it's a soft mobile structure that moves about. So we're looking at challenge. So the way you can replicate that without buying those cushions is the gym ball. The gym ball is a really easy way of doing that, whether it be on the floor, whether it be on a plate. You're doing the same loading. So you're looking at cushion loading, changing positions. Your body has to adapt microscopically to what's happening so that you can challenge the wrist more. So you don't need to buy these. That's just another adjunct. There's lots of them available, as I say, on the Performance Health website, gives you more details about what is available. Some of that is out of stock at the moment, but again, it should be more available soon, but really useful. Let's see if there's any other queries in the chat. But as I say, even if you don't put it in the chat, I'm sure we can get in contact through Performance Health and any messages, and we can provide any sort of advice or experience that we might have, or point you in the right direction to people that have got way more experience than us. So
Okay, so one of the questions that we've got is, what research do we have to support choice of proprioceptive exercises?
limited is the answer. So when you look at the research out there, there's a few papers out there, there's quite a bit around carpal kinematics, lots of evolving research around proprioceptive influence of ligament structures, muscular structures, overuse of FCR, not to overuse extensor carpi ulnaris because it changes the loading across the carpal ligaments. So it can be very confusing. So the evidence out there is essentially looking at the research that shows the amount of mechanoreceptors in the ligament structures. And I suppose the jump from there is that they're there because they give lots of feedback to that. And I think the type of proprioceptive input is thinking about the function of the patient. So what are they trying to do? What is their proprioceptive need? And I think it's looking at control. So the kind of key markers with your patient is the fatigue. So the shaking, the using alternative muscles when they're not controlling that. So I think watch your patient, see how they move, and then devise exercises that challenge that weakness. So what we don't want to give you is a recipe. The recipe isn't good. We want to see our patients, see what they need, and use some of these ideas and skills to create a program for them.
A couple of people want to know about what would you recommend for the frequency of these exercises, repetitions, those sorts of things.
Yeah,
so how often?
So I think, with all of your exercises, remember we're looking at endurance. So endurance is repetitions or good quality repetitions. So when you've got your patient in clinic, don't just say, oh, no, we're going to do two. I'll show you two exercises and off you go. Make them go through to a point of fatigue. Then you start to know where do they start to fatigue. So it may be that your aim is 10 repetitions, but actually after 5, they're really shaking and they're starting to shrug their shoulder or they're starting to flex. The classic one is they start to flex and overuse the more powerful flexors, which we really don't want. So they're the ones to look at. Look at the quality of the movement. I normally say, let's start off with a 10-second hold or 10 to 15-second hold, 10 repetitions, just as a glib figure. No real evidence for that. It just starts off and gives me an idea of where the patient fatigues. If they don't, we can increase it. If they do, we can reduce it down. So be guided by your patient's quality of movement, and that's the key. Control and quality of movement.
Quite a few people asking about, will they receive a recording? So obviously we missed the first bit.
Yes, so for those of you that join late, yes, this will be emailed to you with your registration details and any details of how you might get some of these products from Performance Health. And also it becomes available on the Performance Health website, and that will, all the details of that will come in that email out to you. So that we'll use your registration details to put that out to you.
Somebody else asking about duration of so isometric or static holds. How long would you get?
Yeah, so again, look at quality, look at your patient fatigue. What do? Do they start switching on different muscles? Are they starting to proximally lift their shoulder? Are they really fixing with movements? Because we want controlled movements. Yes, we're looking for stability, but we don't want them clamping in, because that clamp is trying to get stability because the quality distally isn't there. So start with your low resistances, build that up, but watch the quality, watch for abnormal accessory movements, watch for shaking, fatigue, loss of grip.
Something very specific here. So would you retest provocation of wrist pain after exercises to engage core rotator cuff stability to check for any reduction?
It's a difficult one, isn't it? I think with any of those, I wouldn't, depending on your clinic timings, I wouldn't necessarily exercise retest. I know we want an outcome score, an outcome measure to look against, but I might test that over time. We're not expecting in a single session of exercise for our patient to completely transform their symptoms. We might see an easing in their symptoms and a change in their symptoms. What I'm really looking for is that I'm not flaring up their symptoms, and over a period of weeks, over time, that they see an improvement. This isn't a short-term fix. And we're building muscles, we're building control, we're building muscle memory. So that doesn't happen without good quality repetition. So I would retest, but not in that session. I would test over the following follow-up sessions with the patient.
We've got someone asking if you have any experience with amputees. Their question is, can you recommend any resource or material with exercises for amputees who are preparing for their prosthesis?
Yeah, I think the amputees obviously is a different challenge. There's lots of different alterations in their muscle attachments, potentially around the stump. So I think your best resource is your local limb fitting centre. They deal with these patients all the time. You know, certainly where I work, we don't see lots of amputees. We see some, mostly lower limb. But I think if you work in maybe a military environment, then there are lots of blast injury, trauma, and if you're international with some of the things going on in the world at the moment, yes, you may see this a lot more. But contact your local limb fitting centres. If you're international and you don't have a specific local limb fitting centre, I think some of the ones, certainly there's one in Portsmouth here, and there's ones around the country that I would be more than willing to share things. But yeah, it's a much more specialist area, and I think because of the altered muscle attachments, it has a different dynamic to it. But the same principles apply. So I think we're just going to take one more because we're running out of time slightly. And if there are any questions in the chat, we will answer them after the webinar and get back to you with answers if we can.
So last one then, what are the risk factors for people of older age and or with osteoporosis, osteoarthritis, rheumatoid? How would you modify?
So as you would with any exercise really, so you're thinking of, you have patients that are of multiple ages and have multiple fitness levels. So I think, you know, there's a huge amounts of very fit, very active older people. So yes, be guided by their history. Obviously, if they have got osteoporosis, we've said if they've got hypermobility, if they've got osteoarthritis, be aware that you might be aggravating some of those symptoms. So start with a lower load, a lower resistance, gauge their symptoms and build up. Nothing we've done here is contraindicated for any of those type of patients. You just have to be your professional reasoning cap on to go, actually, how far can I push this patient? But nothing's contraindicated, but just be aware of how the patient's reacting and how quickly you increase the resistance. Amazing, thank you very much. So I hopefully that's been useful for you. Some of it may be very familiar, some of it may be new. Hopefully it's given you some thought to take back to your centres to have a chat about and put into practice with some of your patients. So if you do have any other questions, there is contact details that will come out with the email so you can get in contact. We will be doing other webinars over the year and you'll get details through registration details that we've got for you about those upcoming webinars. So really it's just to say thank you very much for joining. Thank you for Chris, who's been sorting our camera work, and Nicola, who's modelled and done the chat. So thank you very much for that. And thank you for joining.